Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Carl Cannon. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, you've probably noticed I'm wearing the same clothes. That's because I'm in New York this week, but the day after the inauguration, I sat down with some of my very favorite thinkers to talk through some of the biggest picture questions about what is happening right now, literally blocks away from our studio here in Washington, D.C., and what that will mean rippling out for the rest of the country in the days and the weeks ahead. So, perhaps the biggest question of Donald Trump's second administration is not about any particular policy, in my opinion at least. It's about whether the media can restore its tattered reputation. Why do I say that? Well, without trust in media, it is impossible for voters to trust almost anything else. That is our window into public affairs from Wall Street to Washington, and it is all cracked and smudged right now. To be clear, those of us who work as journalists have a very deep hole out of which to climb. Gallup has measured media confidence since 1972 and found in its most recent survey that trust in the press was back at the record low that it hit in 2017. For a second consecutive year. Maybe that explains why John Harris, the founding editor of Politico, used his column this week to write a piece headlined, "Time to admit it, Trump is a great president. He's still trying to be a good one." So Harris's piece even drew parallels between Trump and FDR. The coverage overall after Donald Trump's inauguration seemed much more measured, if not entirely fair, more measured at least. Now Harris's tone, you may be shocked to learn, did not extend to the ladies of The View. Take a listen.
The speech itself, I remember when it was done, my first reaction was, what is this country he speaks of? Because I immediately couldn't reconcile the way I see the country and the people and how it is right now and where he saw it. He didn't say carnage, but he said carnage pretty much in everything else. Do you remember the reference from his first inauguration when he said carnage? I just kind of felt this dark feeling. And then he had this kind of martyr-like, you guys are downtrodden and almost irreparable. You can't save this place, but I can. And it had this godlike complex without any Jesus qualities. It was kind of like a juxtaposition. But I was really disappointed, not surprised, just to be clear, but disappointed that there wasn't one kind thing to say about the outgoing administration. Because even...
Au contraire, he was merciless to the outgoing.
That's my point. That's my point.
And a weird but innocuous gesture from Elon Musk got compared to a Nazi salute by some outlets, including Time Magazine. CNN took issue with the gesture as well. This is an important game of tug-of-war that is happening in newsrooms and C-suites at this very moment. Not only does it matter for journalists' integrity and their publications' bottom lines, but the narratives they attempt to set have a significant influence over policy from both Republicans and Democrats. So now felt like a very good time to check in with one of my very favorite journalists, Carl Cannon of RealClearPolitics. Carl, who just launched a new newsletter called Cannon Fodder, by the way, is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a former White House Correspondents Association head, and he's one of the most respected journalists here in Washington, and he's one of the rare reporters who did that, who got that reputation by actually just reporting, which he's done going back to Ronald Reagan. So Carl Cannon, the great Carl Cannon, joins us now. Carl, thank you for being here.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Emily.
Carl, you have seen, I think it's fair to say, more than one inauguration at this point, more than one president take on their first 100 days in office. And I was struck by the news coverage, looking at the front page of all the different papers, the major papers in the country yesterday. They treated Trump, I would say, very differently than 2017. And I'm curious if you've had a similar reaction, Carl, as you've watched sort of the Beltway react to Trump 2.0. Is this time really different than when he first came in? Is the vibe shift real?
Oh, yeah, you're right. And, it's not just the media. I mean, the streets were different. If in 2017, if you wore a MAGA hat, you'd likely get assaulted on the streets of Washington. By contrast, I saw footage of Tucker Carlson wandering the street and people are greeting him, asking for his autograph. So, I think the press was forced to cover this differently because a different thing happened. Trump won in 2017. He lost by 2.5 million votes in the popular vote. He squeaked by in these swing states. And then, they had a rival inauguration. Remember that one, Emily?
Yes.
Women's March, and the speakers were talking about burning down, fantasizing about torching the White House, and it was this violent reaction to him from the left side of the perspective. Well, then they threw everything they had at him for, like 8 years, indicted him like four different places, tried to take his money, all his money in New York in a separate thing, um, you know, charged him with all these things, impeached him twice, turned over the basically upside down journalism, upside down to call him names and say he's a liar and a Nazi and Hitler and all this. And then he wins. And this time he wins the popular vote, carries all the swing states, and he said all the stuff he was going to do. So the media is not, we're not going through the reckoning that we should just yet, but we're taking a pause and saying, okay, wait a minute. The American people wanted this guy. We better treat him like he's the president.
Now, how long does that last? And I know this is maybe the single hardest thing to predict, but I'm curious if, we already saw some of those images from Mexico of people's CBP1 apps with their appointments, vanishing as soon as Donald Trump took office, migrants who were trying to get into the United States. I'm sure when people are fired, if Schedule F actually happens, which would allow Donald Trump to clear out a not insignificant portion of the federal bureaucracy, we'll get tear-jerking images of bureaucrats who have served in the administration, in many administrations over years, with their ferns and their boxes on the sidewalks of Washington, D.C. So do you think this détente, if I can call it that, is durable, Carl?
Probably not for the reasons you said. But Emily, we have to differentiate between what's news, what's not news, and what's news done well. I mean, saying that Elon Musk gave a Hitler salute, that's not news because that didn't happen. But these people tearfully at the border, who at the southern border, I saw some of those, news accounts this morning, as you did, and people waited. They've got their app. The app suddenly went down. They were following what they thought to be the law, and it's news to go interview those people, and those are heartrending stories. But there's the other side to it, and the other side of the story, and this is what I'll be curious to see how it unfolds. If we're covering the news properly, when I say we, I mean I was born and raised in the news business, so I'm talking about the legacy media. That app that those people were following, that the Trump administration shut down, that was a misuse of the refugee law by the Biden administration. That law was never supposed to basically be an open border. Anybody who could make it to the Rio Grande River, past that, could then get a court date 5 years hence and no questions asked. It was meant to protect people who were the victims of persecution because of race or religion or, a desire for freedom. It wasn't meant to be a backdoor to just change the whole immigration law. So these are the complicated stories that the media hasn't been telling well. And I don't know if we got religion on that and we're going to start doing it properly. I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, no, because Dean Baquet said right after the 2016 election to the New York Times newsroom, quote, "We don't get religion." And I actually do think the Times has been sort of trying to grapple with this better than some other papers. I'm thinking of the Washington Post that struggled a lot. But, now I guess, Carl, as you're saying this, I'm wondering if in the weirdest possible way, Trump 2.0 could offer an opportunity for like a media renaissance in a different way than what happened in 2017, where you saw subscriptions to the Times and the Post kind of going through the roof. For the Post, at least, that didn't turn out to be durable. For other publications and outlets that didn't turn out to be durable, Times is still doing all right because they have all of these fancy little subscription bundles. You can pay for recipes and Wordle and all of that fun stuff. But is it possible that now that Donald Trump's back, he's already, just eagerly talking to the press at every given opportunity? It seems like he's making opportunities to talk to the press. This, in a weird way, could be the moment that revitalizes American media. Am I being too optimistic?
No, but that's an interesting point. You raised it because on Inauguration Day, Donald Trump answered questions from the Oval Office with reporters for 90 minutes. I don't think Joe Biden did that in 4 years. I don't think he took questions in the Oval Office. Presidents have done that. He's held the fewest press availabilities of any modern president. Kamala Harris, Emily, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I don't think she's held a press conference to this day from the time that she was, handpicked to be the nominee. So if Trump is going to engage the media, and he seems to be unable not to, this could actually be renaissance is a funny word, but we could start to have the kind of exchanges with the press that are good for the American people. And you suggest good for the media. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I'm curious more to hear more about that, Carl, because you've been around the types of people like you who are the editors at major publications. You've known them. I imagine what you've sensed, probably from some of them, if not most of them, over the last decade, was internal frustration. We actually saw some big names like James Bennett in 2020 kind of get kicked out of the New York Times for publishing that Tom Cotton op-ed. And there was a little bit of a reckoning, it seemed, inside some of the organizations during that time period. But do people kind of feel like maybe they can breathe again? People who've been veterans of the media, that this moment allows them to kind of pursue some good stories, send their reporters to pursue some good stories? Or is your sense that people are still maybe cautious about that?
Well, that's going to unfold in the next year or two. But, Donald Trump gets rid of DEI with a stroke of the pen. He thinks he did that. Well, of course, this is more entrenched than he realizes. And it was called, when I was a young man, affirmative action. And, now called, then called multi or pluralism. It's had these names. DEI is the latest
You're still a young
name.
man, Carl.
Yeah. So, but, conservatives say, what we're doing is getting rid of woke, the woke excess. That's going to be welcome in some newsrooms among some people. Other people are going to feel threatened by it. But Trump's going to go too far. There's a book I have by George Edwards, the political scientist from Texas A&M, and it's something about how they always go too far. But Obama's on the cover, I forget the title of it. It's misreading their mandate or overplaying their hand. Yesterday, Trump just declares by fiat the Gulf of Mexico is going to be called Gulf of America. I don't even know if a president has that authority to rename maps. And, these things are called different things at different kinds of the borders. I mentioned the Rio Grande River. Well, in Mexico, it's called the Rio Bravo River. So, and then says, like he's the emperor, there are only two genders. Well, okay. That's, overreach. That's the title of the book, government overreach. So that's overreach. That's not for him to say. If he wants to minimize this obsession with the Biden administration, with sort of everything that was like the craziest thing on college campus, it's going to be federal law. He can do that, but he can't just declare there are two genders. That the world's more complex than that.
But he can definitely roll back the Obama, then Biden Title IX definitions that said, sex, and on the basis of sex in Title IX must be read as gender identity. It seems like maybe that's probably what the Trump education department, as long as it lasts, will be focused on, these bureaucratic tweets.
That's right. And that would be popular. But again, overreach seems almost a hazard of the job, And so you ask about how the press is going to treat this guy. Well, one thing they're going to do, people at MSNBC and places like that are going to wait, not patiently, for him to overreach. And then they're going to use their favorite word. They're going to pounce.
And so then they end up, this is the doom spiral we've been in. They end up overreaching. That's what happened. Trump says something nice about Putin that an American president probably shouldn't say, and the media blows it into Russian collusion. And we end up, with everyone's institutional trust cratering almost across the board, because it's a doom spiral. It becomes this like arms race to see who can say the craziest thing. And I wonder if Carl, you feel like there's a Democrat who maybe not a major, I don't know. I'm thinking of Gavin Newsom, who's someone you're very familiar with. This is a new media environment. People want to get a sense of authenticity from politicians. This is part of what Donald Trump and actually J.D. Vance do pretty well. They're able to go on these podcasts and riff for a few hours. Kamala Harris could barely get through that Call Her Daddy interview without seeming unlikable, no offense to her, but she just is very scripted. Are Democrats prepared to have somebody like, is Newsom in a position? Is there somebody who, maybe Ruben Gallego, who's in a position to be better at this for Democrats?
Newsom's an interesting one because he's the governor of the largest state in the country. And for a long time, the governor of New York, the governor of California, the governor of Florida, people start looking at these people right away and say, are they presidential timber? That's changed a little bit, but not much. Newsom, he checks a lot of boxes. He's a free market capitalist, which that used to go without saying, but in the Democratic Party, as it's presently constituted, that's a notable achievement. That's something worth talking about. He started in business. He had a restaurant in San Francisco and a bar, and then he expanded as a winery. He believes in free market capitalism and that's the best sort of system. So, and he also on the social and the culture wars. As mayor of San Francisco, he started marrying gays before it was literally before it was legal. The California Supreme Court ruled he had gone up, too far. But now it's the law of the land. And my point is that Newsom checks a lot of these boxes. He also seems to understand what the presidency is. He's picked some fights with Donald Trump. He's picked all kinds of fights with Ron DeSantis, but he hasn't picked unnecessary fights. He hasn't gone out of his way to antagonize Trump or badmouth him, and he works with him when he can. And for most of Trump's time in office, and for about half the time he was out of office, waiting in the wings, he spoke well of Newsom. That's frayed a bit. Now he has a nickname for him that's uncomplimentary, but Newsom's a guy who gets what's going on in the country. People say that the California liberalism won't transfer outside of California. That may be right. But, who's it going to be? It has to be somebody. The Democratic Party right now doesn't have a leader. You have Hakeem Jeffries is going to be, if the Democrats get back the House, he'll be the speaker. All right. Schumer is, kind of yesterday's news. The leader of this party is going to be the person who emerges as the front runner for the Democratic Party nomination in 2028. And to your point, I think that person has to take into account what's happened in the country and how this election in 2024 was in large part a reaction to Democratic Party excess.
Right. Yeah. No, what made me think about that in the context of the media discussion we were having is I was discussing with someone else the other day, the Marshall McLuhan line, very famous, that the medium is the message. And now I think that's something Republicans internalized because Donald Trump forced them virtually at gunpoint to realize it. But for Democrats, that the changing of the mediums is changing the message. It did for Republicans. Republicans just were sort of early to recognize that in a way that Democrats have to realize whatever they're telling voters now needs to be much more pared back and authentic and less scripted. You can't sort of get away with throwing Kamala Harris at voters and expecting them to just love her because when she's on script, she is good. And she can, speak well and she looks good, but people want something a little different now.
Well, what made the media look bad, one of the things in the Kamala Harris thing, it was going to be Biden. Then on June 27th, it's no longer Biden. And a lot of these talking heads, especially in the cable, but not only them, had been very dismissive of Kamala Harris. They had been openly questioned Biden for even choosing her, and they were dismissive of her political skills. Suddenly Biden's out and she's the second coming of Franklin Roosevelt. They looked hypocritical doing it. In a similar note, Twitter, I guess I have to call it X now, is full of these montages of Democrats saying, well, Joe Biden would never, pardon Hunter Biden because he believes in the rule of law. Only Trump would do something like that. And these talking heads and columnists who were much more scathing of Trump for considering pardoning his family, he never did it, than they were of Joe Biden actually pardoning his family. Well, readers and viewers, online or traditional media, they see through that. And if the media is going to be seen as an adjunct of the DNC, that's a problem.
Yeah, and you remember this better than I do because I don't remember it. I've only read about it. But the Reagan administration, and actually the Reagan Revolution, comes in and it's Morning in America, famous ad. A lot of people around the country feel like Republicans have not just the political momentum, but the cultural momentum in a way that reminds some people and some, old Reagan hands that I've talked to of what's happened right now. It seems to me that what's happened right now is actually much more powerful than that, given Donald Trump's he was hosting a primetime television show. Ronald Reagan was an actor, but he wasn't hosting for a decade plus a very popular primetime television show. This, to me, with all of these business leaders, Reagan had a lot of business leaders, but this is, to me, just seems like a level, on a different level, stratospheric cultural clout. But I'm curious what you think about that, Carl.
All right. Well, I'll correct one misconception you have.
Come on.
Ronald Reagan was not only a two-term governor of California, and when he was reelected in 1984, which is the year that this sort of compares to, he'd had a show for 10 years on GE Theater. He was known, and part of his job, it was every Sunday night, and part of his job for 10 years is to travel to these plants to speak to General Electric workers. Mm-hmm. So people knew Reagan, and the ordinary American knew him much better than the political reporters did when he first ran for president. and also when he ran for governor. So there is that parallel there. The other thing is Trump himself has made this comparison: morning in America, make America great again. And there's two things I'll say about what you said. First of all, I agree with you completely. This seems much more potent and powerful and visceral and emotional with people than that did, which is ironic because Reagan really did win a landslide. Trump keeps saying he won a landslide, but actually Trump won a very close election. He beat Kamala Harris by maybe a point and a half in the popular vote, but he didn't get 50% of the vote. And he won all these swing states, but he won them narrowly. Ronald Reagan won every state, every swing state, and every state except Minnesota, and he had closer to 60% of the vote. It was a landslide of historic proportions, and Reagan came and also a very cold inaugural day in 1985, moved inside like this one was. But somehow, despite this victory being narrow and the country being more divided, the energy of this movement does feel greater, and I remember them both. And maybe because this is a populist insurrection, and it's attracted people who haven't. Some of them have never voted for Republican in their lives. A lot of them have never voted in their lives, and you have working class Hispanic men voting for Trump, not for the Democrats. So sort of rejecting all of the existing paradigms. And in Trump's mind, it seems that this is not the start, because the start would have come 2016, but this is a real movement now that has a chance to realign American politics in a serious and lasting way that leaves the Democrats kind of gasping for air. That's the vibe that Trump is conveying. And I agree with you. It's kind of the vibe that's out there.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And the Sunday night thing, my minor rebuttal is that I don't think it's technically prime time if it's Sunday, but I have been humbly the point is taken. The Reagan historian got the better.
You're not going to pass a fact check on it anyway, Emily. Let's just move on.
That's a good point. But so that's the last question I have for you, Carl, is how this translates into the political kind of permission structure, I guess might be the way to put it, because actually the Reagan administration was getting criticized by, I want to say it was like the Heritage Foundation or Cato back in the mid 80s for not immediately moving to get rid of the Department of Education, because the conservative movement that had sprouted up around William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater amidst the sort of federal civil rights push and the Great Society push really wanted to pare back government then, when some of these agencies were 20 years old, 10 years old, like the EPA at that time, for example, and it didn't happen.
Well, and the Department of Education was brand new. Jimmy Carter had brought it. It was his gift to the teachers union. Gift may be a polite word. It was maybe more like a bribe. He promised to do it, and he did it. Reagan didn't like it, but he didn't push to get rid of it. He didn't get pushed to get rid of Roe v. Wade. And took some heat from socialist conservatives about that. And I remember in the mid 80s, what he really got grief from. George Will wrote a column that he capitulated. William F. Buckley came to the White House and Reagan couldn't change his mind, was dealing with the Russians, the Soviet Union. So it doesn't, and that sounds a little bit like the grief Trump gets over Putin, doesn't it? But yeah, Reagan held fast. He knew what he wanted to do. He believed in nuclear disarmament. And people, Emily, we should just say Barack Obama said this himself. Reagan couldn't get nominated today in the Republican Party. Well, that's crazy. Obama should know better, because Reagan was like Obama. He was a once in a generational talent who could have gotten elected in any party in any time. Mm-hmm. But the point is that the institutional right pushed back on Reagan. He held firm, and he had a vision. And I guess, the Reagan people really hate having Trump compared to Reagan, because they think of Reagan as such a gentlemanly person. But Trump does seem to know who he is. He does seem to know what he wants. That wasn't so clear to me the first time he was in office. But doesn't it seem, the flurry of executive orders, this frenetic activity on day one, doesn't it seem like he does know what he wants and he thinks the public is behind him?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that's just final. This is the actual last question, because what you said was so interesting. There are a lot of people on the left who look back at the Reagan era, and they will argue this was when the, barriers to capitalism, they will argue, were dismantled. And the things that kept our social fabric together were dismantled by the rich, et cetera. So they look at that as a time period of genuine economic revolution, civic revolution. But I guess the reason I'm asking that is, I bet a lot of people are looking at Donald Trump right now and saying, here he is on stage with the TikTok CEO, with Jeff Bezos, with oligarchs, oligarchs, and is this the time period where what was left of the social fabric is finally burned? But does Trump have to your point about he knows himself now, he's done this flurry of executive actions, does that mean that he actually is going to do all of that? Can he do all of that? Like, what will America look dramatically different after the Trump presidency, whether for better or worse, basically, is the question I have, Carl.
Well, Trump is not an ideologue, and that's good and bad. I mean, it's good because it allows him to make deals, and he fancies himself a deal maker. He was against TikTok before he was for it. Okay. A president needs to have some versatility and not be wed to such a rigid viewpoint that he can't adjust to reality. On the other hand, it's sometimes he doesn't even seem to have an ideology. This guy was a Democrat. He was in the Reform Party. He was an independent before he became a Republican. There are times he's out in the stump. In 2016, this was true, and it's true this time. If you close your eyes and think about it, he could have run as a Democrat. Now we had to maybe demagogue on different issues. Abortion would have been a different. He'd have been on the other side of that. But in 2016, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump said the exact same things about NAFTA while campaigning in Indiana, and that was the state where Trump clinched the nomination, and it was evident that Hillary Clinton was going to have problems because Bernie Sanders beat her there, and she was having trouble in these states where Trump was doing well and Sanders was doing well. She had trouble in those states in the general election. So there is some realignment going on, but sometimes it's not clear where Trump wants to take the country, and I think this is because, in one way, he's fundamentally different than Ronald Reagan. Reagan used to, he didn't care who got the credit as long as he got what he wanted. Trump seems to care intensely about getting the credit. And to your question of where he wants to take the country and where we're headed, that will somewhat rest on whether Donald Trump is able to tame this instinct of his to always be boasting, instead, roll up his sleeves and satisfy himself on getting some things done that he really thinks do make America great again.
Carl Cannon, I could pick your brain for hours at any given moment, but this is fascinating. You are a fountain of wisdom and knowledge, so thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Emily.
I could really listen to Carl Cannon all day. He is incredible, and just to get his perspective on what's going on in media, he talks to everyone, he knows everyone. It's a really helpful way to take the temperature of the industry and to contextualize it in the last century of American history. Carl's able to do both. So that was awesome. Really appreciate him being here. Appreciate you subscribing. Please make sure to subscribe here on the channel if you haven't. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts if you're a listener like I am. And of course, over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. We'll see you back here with more soon.